Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Tadale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadabhaktaya Namo Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhuvevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dandavat Pranam devotees. So I'm doing one of the question and answer sessions. I received not a question, but something that was sent to me via email from a very senior devotee. And I'm just trying to get a few things in order so that we can go through this. And it was regarding something that's sort of a perennial issue. It comes up every year. Probably if we took the time to analyze it, we could even probably time it at what time of year that it comes up. But it is in regard to the origin of the jiva and the nature of the jiva's sojourn in the material world. I've spoken about it before in the same vein of questions and answers, or something I received as an inbox, or a class that I heard that I felt the need to comment on. I'm not a very significant devotee, so I'm only presenting from what I've heard from Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra, and what I've understood. My recommendation is that individuals should apply their own program of looking at Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra and laying out all of the evidence, and then applying the sincerity of prayer to the lotus feet of their Guru Parapadma, and begging for realization or understanding of this tattva, this siddhanta. So I'm not speaking this to create a dichotomy of us against them, or that side, this side. I don't like to participate in such things. But at the same time, as a service to the lotus feet of my Guru Parapadma, and for my own edification as well, I'm repeating what is in Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra on this topic, and I want to do so today in line with what was sent to me by this very senior devotee. And that devotee, he is clear. So he wasn't sending it to me as his own perspective. He was saying, this is what is being said in some circles. So I don't want to spend a long time, so let me try to get to the point. So normally whenever we discuss the issue of the jiva and the fall or not fall of the jiva, there's two perspectives that can be taken. One is that it's not important, that however we ended up here, the main business is to get out. Now, Srila Prabhupada has certainly said that. Our Srila Prabhupada has certainly said that. And that is a viable view of the Siddhanta, and, a viable view of the topic. And if a person takes that perspective, goes on practicing bhakti sincerely, there would be no impediment to having realization of the absolute truth, etc., etc. So, on the other hand, if we take that approach, that it really doesn't matter how we got here, the important thing is what we do now, and try to extricate ourselves by the mercy of Guru and Bhakti Shakti to get out, then that's fine. But if you add to that and say, but we fell from the spiritual world, it's no longer the neutral posture of it doesn't matter how we got here, because now someone is asserting a particular idea of how we got here. And then the question becomes, is that siddhanta or not? So the next thing is that the argument will be, well, our Srila Prabhupada has certainly said that the jiva originally had a relationship with Krishna, or originally was with Krishna, or in other words, they have fallen away from their constitutional position. So there are many quotes you can find both throughout Srila Prabhupada's writings and throughout conversations and letters, etc. of Srila Prabhupada, where this indication is clear that somehow we left the association of the spiritual world and being attracted to Maya or being overcome by Maya, came into the material world. Now, in other places, particularly in one place which seems very conclusive, the 7th canto Srimad Bhagavatam, 1st chapter, text number 35, Srila Prabhupada brings up, based on the query of Yudhisthira Maharaj to Narada Muni, when Narada Muni is describing the cursing by the 4 Kumaras of Jai and Vijay and their subsequent coming to the material world for the purpose of Leela, then Maharaj Yudhisthira immediately raises a question or doubt rather. Please, I can't not accept that the infallible associates of Bhagavan can fall due to the curse of anyone from the spiritual world. I'm paraphrasing here. So in that purport, Srila Prabhupada goes on to describe that normally, and Srila Prabhupada says this very clearly, that unless there is something to be done on behalf of the Lord, which in the case of Jai and Vijay, we know from unlimited sastric references that they did not fall from the spiritual world. It's quoted in Srimad Bhagavatam, Samrama Sambrita Samari Anubhadi Yoga, that their coming to the material world was to fulfill the desire of Bhagavan to taste Vira Ras. Vira Ras is one of the 12 types of rasa. There are 5 primary rasas and 7 secondary rasas. One secondary rasa is called Vira Ras, or chivalry. To taste that mood, Bhagavan enlisted his own devotees, because the devotee is the repository of praying in which Ras is possible. You cannot get Ras from those who are not devotees. So Bhagavan enlisted Jai and Vijay to come and perform the Leelas of Hiranyaksha, Hiranyakasipu, Ravan, Kumbhakana, and then Sishupal and Dantavakra. And especially as Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakasipu, he tasted Vira Ras. So Srila Prabhupada says, unless there is something like this to be done on behalf of the Lord, it should be concluded that no one falls from Vaikuntha. If you go back and look at that time period, and perhaps look at the nature of questions and conjectures and other things that were going on around this issue, apparently Srila Prabhupada's statement here wanted to clarify if there was any misunderstanding of the Siddhanta, that no one can fall from the spiritual world. So now the quandary becomes, but there are so many statements Srila Prabhupada has made indicating, referencing, or giving insinuation that someone can fall from the spiritual world. So now we have to speak to something in order to reconcile these two things. One, what was the motive and intent of both statements? Two, is there precedent for one statement if that statement turns out not to be a statement of Siddhanta, but rather a statement which may be applicable for time, place, circumstance, more importantly, the understanding of the audience being spoken to. So if we look at both statements and then we take out the tools that have been given to us to analyze what is Siddhanta, which is Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra, you cannot find anywhere in Sastra the idea that a jiva falls from a relationship with Krishna in the spiritual world. Right? I'm out the whole Tatastha Shakti. We will deal with that if I can now, not maybe in another conversation. But we certainly don't find any evidence anywhere in Sastra that jivas fall from a relationship with Krishna or Sri Narayan or Sri Ramachandra and Ayoja, and they fall into the material world. So the Srimad Bhagavatam is our mool praman for everything. Srila Jiva Goswami Pad, in writing the Satsandarbhas, his mool praman for everything that he expounded on in the Satsandarbhas was Srimad Bhagavatam. So out of 18,000 verses in the Srimad Bhagavatam, we don't find any verse there among 18,000 which says that we fell from the spiritual world unless the verse is allegorical. So this brings us to another point. I'm going to quote two verses here. The first verse is from the 4th chapter Srimad Bhagavatam. I think it is the 28th chapter, and it's perhaps verse 58, 59, or 60. I can try to look. Let me look at the verse, and I will just give you the actual number so that there's no confusion if you want to look it up for yourself. Yes, it's going to be verse number 55. Verse number 55, 4th canto Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 28. So the verse is Swatam Vihaya Mam Bhando Gato Gramya Matir Mahim Vicharan Padam Adrakshihi Kayachin Nirmitam Striya. So it's translated, my dear friend, you are now my very same friend. Since you left me, you've become more and more materialistic, and not seeing me, you've been traveling in different forms throughout this material world, which was created by some woman. So let's start to break down this verse first of all. And first of all, most importantly, let's do the Sangati. Sangati means the contextual relationship of this verse. So what's happening? So this is coming in Narada and Prachinabhari Sambad. In other words, Narada Muni is giving instructions to Prachinabhari. In the course of giving that instruction, he gives a story of a allegorical figure called Puranjan. In the course of that description, Puranjan, being over-attached, becomes born again as a woman. That woman's husband dies and the woman is lamenting, and now the super soul himself appears before that woman to give consolation. And in the context of giving consolation, it has a verse that we're reading here, that you are my very dear friend, and now that same friend, since you have left me, you become more and more materialistic. So the inference would be that we were once with Bhagavan in a friendly relationship. Somehow or another, we left Bhagavan and we came to the material world, and since that time we've been wandering throughout the material world in different bodies, etc., etc. So, Srila Prabhupada in that purport says, when the living entity falls down, so here you have this direct statement, when the living entity falls down, he goes into the material world. So now, somebody might just right there stop everything and say, boss, there's Srila Prabhupada's conclusive statement that the jiva can fall from the spiritual world. The problem is, some cantos later, 3 cantos later, Srila Prabhupada says conclusively, no one falls from Vaikuntha. So now we definitely have to have some kind of reconciliation. So where will we find the ability to reconcile? Well, we'll have to stay within the shelter of Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra. And among Sastra, Amul Praman, being Srimad Bhagavatam, we will have to stay there and get an idea what was the motive and intent of both the speaker here, meaning Narada Muni to Maharaj Prachinabhari, and subsequently our Srila Prabhupada to us. So now, if you will go, perhaps, 8, 9 verses later, it's going to be the first verse of chapter 29 of Canto 4. This verse comes. Prachinabhari uvacha bhagavam ste vacho smabhir na samyak avagamyate kavyasthat vijnananti na vayam karma mohita. King Prachinabhari replied, right? Because now Prachinabhari, after hearing this whole story, he's replying to Narada Muni. And he says, my dear Lord, I could not appreciate completely the purport of your allegorical story of King Puranjan. So after hearing this whole story, inclusive of the verse we just read, then Maharaj Prachinabhari replies to Nard, listen, You just told me an allegorical story, but I couldn't fully comprehend the purport of that allegory. He then says, actually those who are perfect in spiritual knowledge can understand. But for us who are overly attached to fruitive activities, to realize the purport of your story is very difficult. So raise your hands if when Srila Prabhupada came and Srila Prabhupada was initially giving the teachings of Atma Tattva, you were perhaps involved in fruitive activities and perhaps might not have been able to understand the depth of a deep conversation on Atma Gyan and Atma Tattva and the origin of the Jiva, etc. If you were involved in material life, but you had come to Bhakti, is it possible that maybe we could not, like Maharaj Prachinabar is telling to Nard, that we would have not understand such things? Therefore, is it possible that Srila Prabhupada, having the precedent of Nard Muni, one of our 12 Mahajans, setting the example of using allegory to make a Siddhanta understood, right? That could have possibly been motive and intent of Srila Prabhupada to follow suit with a Mahajan like Nard Muni to explain to those who may not be able to understand because we were involved in material activities and fruitive activities? Is it possible that I would not have been able to understand? So Srila Prabhupada took, out of his causeless mercy, the time to use allegory to create the deep conception in my heart that I do have a relationship with Bhagavan, a constitutional one, not a historical one, but a constitutional one. And that somehow I've fallen away from that, and the process of bhakti and Srila Prabhupada's amazing mercy on us to help us to regain a constitutional understanding, not a historical one, right, of our relationship with Bhagavan. So he would also use allegory in the same way that the Mahajan Nard used to Prachinabari. But when it came to discussing what the actual Siddhanta is, supported by all Sastra, all Guru, and all Sadhu, that conclusively, unless there's something to be done on behalf of the Lord, no one falls from Vaikuntha. And unlike Maharaj Prachinabari, Yudhisthira Maharaj, being a high class of devotee and Vaishnav, he immediately brought that question up to Nard. Prachinabari could not understand the allegorical story. But Yudhisthira Maharaj immediately challenged, listen, how is it possible that eternal associates can fall from the spiritual world? So once we have maturation to some degree, like Maharaj Yudhisthira, that question will come. How is it possible eternal associates can fall? Therefore, in that purport, Srila Prabhupada answers according to great devotees like Yudhisthira Maharaj, and he answers like Mahajan's Nard by saying, no one falls from Vaikuntha. So now we have clear understanding in terms of perspective on both statements. One is an allegory to help us understand Atma Tattva and the constitutional nature of a relationship with Krishna, not a historical one. And we have the Siddhantic statement, which aligns with all Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra, that it is not possible to fall from the spiritual world. Sada Mirastam Kuhakam, in the very first verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, it is stated there is no illusion in the spiritual world. So it is not possible to be overcome by an influence which would make us leave the spiritual world. Similarly, Rupa Goswami Pad has talked about what is the definition of praying. There he said, Savata Donksarayitam Yarapi Donkshakarane Yad Bhava Bandhano Yuno Prema Parikirtita. In describing prema, he says it is something that cannot be broken even when there is a cause for it to be broken. So there is nothing which can break an established relationship with Krishna. And those who are eternally perfected in a relationship with Krishna have no ability to become influenced by something else. I could give a whole, and if anybody asks me, maybe I'll put it in the comments, there are a whole series of sastric statements which have been documented by Srila Prabhupada, by some devotees of Srila Prabhupada, giving all the evidence for what I'm saying, that nobody can fall from the spiritual world. Now, in the I guess, hope for harmony among the various opinions, perhaps some devotees have said, well, let's just accept both statements. The difficulty here will be that these statements are diametrically opposed and they have to be reconciled. They cannot be accepted as both things being true, or both things being Siddhanta, I should say. But they can both be accepted according to the context and the motive and intent for which they are meant. One is meant as the absolute teaching regarding the Siddhanta of Atma Tattva. One is meant as a way to explain Atma Tattva to those who were coming from material fruitive activities who may not have been able to understand an explanation of the Siddhanta. So perhaps it is my pride which would have made me think, oh, no, I was completely eligible. Therefore, I will conjecture, rationalize, and do everything else to make this statement that I want to accept true, as opposed to what is conclusively stated by Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra. The other thing is, what is the actual origin of the jiva in the material world? I will give two references. One is the 11th canto, Srimad Bhagavatam, 22:10, 11:22:10. So, Anadi avidya yuktasha purushasya veda atmanam. Swato na sambhavantiyanya ganadva ganado bhavet. So here this verse says that the jiva sojourn or connection with avidya, meaning the material world, is anadi. The word anadi literally means, adi means beginning, anadi means no beginning. There is no beginning to the connection of the jiva, the bada jiva, with material energy. Similarly, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, in his commentary on the 13th chapter, verse 20 of Bhagavad Gita, the verse is Prakritim Purushanchaiva Vidya Anadi Uboapi Vikramascha Gunaischaiva Vidi Prakriti Sambhavan. So I'm reading the first the verse is that you should know that both Prakriti and the Purusha to be without beginning. Right? So the jivas have no beginning. The jivas have no genesis. Right? The jivas are eternal. Right? Krishna says Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. They're eternal. They exist in two states. One is Nitya Siddha, eternally accomplished, and the other is Anadi Bada. So sometimes the word Nitya Bada is used, but Jiva Goswami Pad is told Nitya Bada here means Anadi Bada. From time without any beginning, the jiva has been conditioned by avidya. So now I'm going to read first authority of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur Pad on this issue. So it says, after explaining Paramatma, Sri Bhagavan is now explaining the Jivatman, who is also known as the Kshetragya. Why did the relationship between the Kshetragya and Maya Prakriti occur, and when did it start? So he's asking and answering this question right here. So he says, I'm going to read the question again. Why did the relationship between this Kshetragya, means the Atma or Jiva or the soul, and Maya or Prakriti occur, and when did it start? So expecting this question, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur Pad says, expecting this question, Bhagavan answers with this verse beginning Prakriti. So what is his answer? That Prakriti and the Jiva are Anadi. Their connection with each other is Anadi. Because I've also given evidence from Amul Praman, Srimad Bhagavatam. Next evolution, Mukunda. If we've been in this material jagat, material world from Anadikal, and we've been suffering from Anadikal, who's responsible for that? So if you read the 15th and 16th chapter of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's Jaiva Dharma, all of these things are made clear. But one point only on the idea of suffering. Many times what is very difficult for aspiring devotees to accept is that it is possible to have been in the material world, knowing the material world to be a place of suffering from time without any beginning, and that Krishna somehow was okay with that. But first of all, we need to be clear. We need to analyze, first of all, what is suffering? Jiva Goswami Pad in the Paramatma Sandarbha, beginning at Anuched 19, he starts to describe the nature of the Jivatma. And he describes 21 qualities. Among those 21 qualities, one quality is Chid Ananda Atmaka. Then Jiva Goswami comments on what is the meaning of Chid Ananda Atmaka. One is that he's not jud, means he's not inert, the Jiva. Secondly, that he's Dukkha Pratyogita. Dukkha Pratyogita means there is no misery in the Atma itself. If there's no misery in the Atma, where is misery coming from? Misery is the result of the vicarious identification of the Atma with the three modes of material nature. By that vicarious identification, because the Atma never touches material energy. Asango hiyanyam purusha. This is Upanishadic statement. Never touches the material energy. But just like looking at a big television screen or movie screen or looking at a drama, we vicariously identify with a character, which is the composite of our karmic portfolio from one life to another, and under the influence of avidya, which produces the ignorance of my actual identity, spiritual identity, and it gives rise to ahamkara. Ahamkara means I am the karta and karana, the cause and doer of activities. So Bhagavad Gita, Krishna has clearly said, Prakriti kriya manani gunai kamani savasha. Ahamkara vimudatma. Karatamiti manyate. This is the avidya or bewilderment of the jiva. So interacting with the modes of nature, the jiva thinks themselves the doer. In order to carry out this fallacy of being the doer, and upadi arises. Upadi means a designation. That designation is based on karma. Karmana daivana natrena jantur dehopapatye. Shri Uttara Praveshta Pumsam Reta Karnasaya. I believe this comes in the teachings of Kapila and Devahuti. That he's explaining that the Atma is sojourning in the material world from one body to another via the male semen into the womb of a particular woman, and then from that karmic portfolio from one life to another, Karmana Dhavana Natrena, a particular upadi comes. Oh, I was born to this family, in this race, in this country, at this time, with this particular quality or that quality, and my designation is by this name, etc. This is called upadi. So ahamkara and upadi are there. Under the influence of avidya, it gives rise to a duality called rag and dvesh. Because the nature of the Atma is Ananda, and in the material world, the nature of Ananda is fettered by the rotation of the modes of nature. So nobody can find complete unfettered happiness in the material world. But because it's the nature of the Atma is always looking for it. So it gives rise to the duality of rag and dvesh, attachment and aversion. Now, another thing is, one of the reasons that people say you can fall from the spiritual world is free will. But actually, free will is not absolute. Free will is really an ingredient of love. It is not an absolute independent ability in the soul. And this next point will prove it. The next feature of the 5 features, I've told 4, the 5th feature of avidya or ignorance is called abhinivesh. And abhinivesh is the power of illusion or ignorance to keep the jiva fettered and not allow them to extricate themselves. So in the verse that I quoted from the 11th canto, the 3rd line says, what is that? Anarya Vijay Yuktasha Purushasha Vedatmanam Swato Na Sambhavantyanya. Swato Na means on your own you can't extricate yourself. If your free will was powerful enough to allow you to somehow fall from the spiritual world due to it, why wouldn't that same free will be powerful enough for you to extricate yourself from the inferior energy of God? It's powerful enough, you're saying, that it can break the nature of love in the infallible world, the spiritual world. But it is not powerful enough to break the relationship with the inferior energy of God. So the idea of free will being some absolute thing is not a reality. It is a function given to the jiva to exercise praying. It is not an absolute thing. And if it is absolute, you should be able to just turn around and say, hey, I'm not going to be in Maya anymore, starting from tomorrow. Right? Because today you want to enjoy yourself. All right, I'm being funny now, but hey, listen, you cannot extricate yourself from Maya, because the last line of that verse says, Ganatwa Ganado Bhavet. It requires the assistance of an already liberated person. So this means your free will is not also the reason that you can fall from the spiritual world. So why, again, has Al Srila Prabhupada and other acharyas, also, not only Al Srila Prabhupada, given the idea of a misuse of free will? They're not speaking about a historical genesis of the misuse of free will. They're talking about 5 minutes ago. Was I fully surrendered 5 minutes ago, 2 minutes ago? We don't have to go back to historical genesis. Now that may line up with our Judeo-Christian background regarding an original sin, etc., Adam and Eve. But in reality, the idea of being tatashta or marginal, which let me come to that point now. Tatashta means tatashta swabhav, the tendency or nature of being tatashta, not a locale. I'm not going to expand on that now because I don't think I have enough time. But basically, having this tatashta swabhav is something that is part of the jiva's anadi bada existence in the material world. They have the tendency to be influenced by material energy, and until they surrender, especially to the lotus feet of any guru sadhu who is self-realized and who has the potency to give them the ability to begin to extricate themselves, then their free will has no potency. That free will, because Jiva Goswami also mentioned, in the spiritual world we have kartatva. Kartatva means you can be the doer. By the influence and potency of love, you can exercise the freedom to serve Bhagavan in so many ways. But that power of free will is neither a cause to fall, nor is it the ability to get out of the material entanglement. Right? So once we do surrender, then the influence of the spiritual energy can start to come. Now, from what I just described, and we take the perspective especially on the idea that the suffering is a vicarious phenomenon, it's not something that's actually part of the Atma. We experience it according to the nature of our attachment vicariously to looking at the drama being played out by the three modes of material nature. Just like someone watches a drama or watches a movie or something and becomes so absorbed in that movie, they give identification to the plot, the characters, etc., and therefore they ride the emotional wave of happiness and sadness, etc. That's exactly what's happening to the Atma, observing the influence and functions of the modes of nature and identifying with the plot, the character, and inserting themselves via ahamkar and upadi into that drama. And therefore they're experiencing the emotional roller coaster of happiness, distress, etc., etc. Now you can't simply turn off that idea, oh, okay, now I understand, so from tomorrow I'm going to turn it off, I'll just be happy. No, because the actual happiness is derived when the soul is not only in its original nature, which makes it suitable, but when Swarup Shakti, which is the spiritual energy, Antaranga Shakti, that spiritual energy touches and influences the Atma. And then the Atma and that Swarup Shakti have a natural prayuj, sort of a natural bonding. And the influence of that spiritual energy is what creates unlimited ananda. Shri Baladev Vijayabhushan Prabhu, Srila Baladev Vijayabhushan Acharya has written, quoted from the Upanishads rather, Rasam evam labdananda bhavati. Though the basic composition of the Atmas is dukkha pratiyogitva, it is free from misery, it has the capacity to experience unlimited ananda. That unlimited ananda will be proportionate to the influence of Swarup Shakti and the nature of Bhagavat Seva, etc., etc. So I don't want to belabor the point, and also perhaps we've ventured into a few areas which weren't directly addressing the issue, but I think it's all relatable. So takeaways. One is that Siddhanta and the nature of instructions appropriate to an audience for time, place, circumstances are two different things. Do we have precedent in Sastra for using the idea of allegory or any other means to help people understand who may not be capable of understanding? Yes, Mahajan Narad Muni did with Prachinabhari. It was not a literal historical thing, it was an allegorical story. So therefore, our Srila Prabhupada and many acharyas using allegory to instill the concepts of bhakti in those who may not understand a Siddhanta is completely authorized. Secondly, there is a Siddhanta regarding an issue, and in maturation, we come to understand that Siddhanta. 7th Canto Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada clears, no one falls from Vaikuntha. All of the Guru Sadhu and Sastra say same thing. This is called Siddhanta. Third, what is our origin? Well, we've been a Nadi Bada. We've been in the material world without any beginning. Sometimes time immemorial is used. Again, it's used so that we don't have an idea that we don't have a constitutional relationship with Bhagavan, though we don't have an historical one. Right? So that's why the term time immemorial has been used. It doesn't mean historically, I just couldn't remember it, but I was actually there in all of these things, because we've just proven that's not true. Right? So, the idea of suffering. Actually, the Atma's never been suffering. It's identification with material energy that is suffering. And part of the proof of that is that if you look, and this is why we have to stop looking at Srimad Bhagavatam simply as like, if you do this, I'm not criticizing here. I'm saying that we can't look at it as like a mythological story or something, even though nobody obviously would think like that. They don't think they're doing that. But the tendency is, if you look at the suffering of the devotees of Bhagavan, what is the difference between the activities they go through, which apparently give suffering, and what we go through here? The difference is not just that's the spiritual world, this is the material world. What makes the spiritual world and what makes the material world? What makes the spiritual world is that everything is done only for the interest of Krishna. Atma sukhe dukkhe gopiyo na karele vichar. For instance, the gopis never considered their own happiness or distress. They did everything only for the pleasure of Krishna. Atma indriya priti tare vanche bhare kam. In the material world, everybody has self-interest. And along with that self-interest comes the duality of happiness and distress. But in the spiritual world, because there is no self-interest, there's only interest in pleasing Bhagavan, it can only produce ananda in variety. Therefore, even though the Pandavas were sent to a house of lack, their kingdom was taken, their wife was insulted, their mother suffered greatly, their father died, right? The whole experience of the Pandavas, though it appeared to be suffering, they never blamed Bhagavan because they always felt ananda. Therefore, Kunti told, when Krishna was returning to Dwarka from Indraprastha, oh, please, I'd rather the sufferings come again and again so that we can have your darshan. You understand? So the idea that Bhagavan placed the jiva here and the jiva just suffered, that doesn't seem tenable because we misunderstand what is suffering. Understand? All right, so I think I will leave it here. If anybody has any additional questions, you can always either write it on the comment section here, or you can write me inbox personally and so forth. And to that very senior devotee, I don't mention names only because I don't have permission, but he's a very senior devotee and he knows all this tattva. But he sent me this because it was, someone had written it, and I guess someone of influence had written it, and this understanding was being promoted there regarding this verse from Srimad Bhagavatam being proof that we did fall. I've just shown that actually contextually in the whole story, it was simply an allegorical story told to help understand Atma Tattva, right? Of course, in the purport of the first verse of the next chapter, Srila Prabhupada himself, twice in the purport says, this is an allegorical story. Right? All right, my Dandavat Pranam devotees, Vancha Kalpatarubhischa, Kripa Shindavevacha, Patitanam Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo, Namo Namaha, Jai Radhe Radhe.